What if the man who promised to protect your town simply vanished one October night, and no one ever found him? 20 years later, the truth rises from the river, darker than anyone imagined. If you've ever lived in a small town where trust felt sacred, and then shattered, this story will hit home. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Because sometimes, justice doesn't die. It just disappears. The morning of October 14th, 2002, began like any other in Asheville, North Carolina, a quiet mountain town where the air still held the crisp edge of early fall, and the smell of wet leaves drifted through the valley. People were getting ready for work, the same coffee brewing, the same radios humming with early news. Nothing about that Monday hinted that it would carve a wound into the town's heart, one that would never quite heal. Detective Harris Cole had worked the night shift before. His wife, Laura, was used to it, the late calls, the coffee going cold on the kitchen counter, the hum of the police scanner that she couldn't bring herself to turn off. For 20 years, Harris had worn the badge with the kind of pride people in small towns still believed in. He wasn't the kind of man who took shortcuts or looked away. He saw things through. That's what made him good, and what made him dangerous to the wrong people. At 6:15 a.m., the phone rang. Laura thought it was Harris, calling to say he'd grab breakfast at the diner like he often did. Instead, it was Chief Raymond Davis, his voice tight, almost trembling. "Laura, Harris didn't come back from patrol last night." Those words cracked something inside her. "What do you mean, didn't come back?" she asked. There was a pause long enough to drown in. "We found his unit by the river," the chief said quietly. "His radio's still on." "Oh." Within 30 minutes, patrol cars filled the road leading down to the French Broad River, lights reflecting red and blue across the water. The fog was heavy, the kind that swallows sound. When officers opened the door of the Ford Crown Victoria, the heater was still running, a half-empty cup of coffee in the holder, and the faint smell of Harris's cologne lingering inside. The driver's seat was pushed back, as if he'd been talking to someone through the window. His watch lay on the floorboard, stopped at 11:47 p.m. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away. Only silence, and the badge on the passenger seat, glinting faintly in the dawn light. Chief Davis rubbed his hands together, staring at that badge as if it could answer him. "Men like Harris don't just walk off," he muttered. "Something's wrong." By noon, the entire department was mobilized. Helicopters circled overhead. Search dogs traced the riverbank, their paws splashing through mud and broken reeds. Dozens of volunteers lined up to comb through the woods. The local news vans parked near the bridge, broadcasting live updates that said everything and nothing at once. "Detective missing after night patrol," the headline read. No one dared say the word dead. Laura stood near the river with her daughter Sophie, just 14, and her son Evan, 16. She clutched Harris's jacket to her chest. "He wouldn't leave us," she whispered, over and over, like a prayer trying to beat back panic. Evan stared at the water, fists clenched. "He's not gone, Mom. He's out there." As night fell, spotlights flickered along the bank. Officers waded into the current, calling his name, but the only answer was the soft hiss of water against stone. When they pulled up a piece of fabric from the shallows, dark, torn, heavy with river silt, Laura thought it was part of his jacket. It wasn't. It was just an old tarp. False hope. Again. Chief Davis put a hand on her shoulder. "We'll find him," he promised, but his eyes didn't believe it. For 3 days, the search continued. Reporters camped outside the station. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said Harris had run off. Others whispered he'd been caught in something deeper, something no one wanted to name. The department issued a statement. "Detective Harris Cole is missing under suspicious circumstances." That phrase would haunt the next 2 decades. At the Cole home, the police scanner stayed on day and night. Laura couldn't bear to turn it off. Sometimes, she thought she heard Harris's voice through the static, a trick of exhaustion and grief. On the 3rd night, she found herself walking into his office, looking at the case files on his desk. One folder sat open, its title smudged with fingerprints, Narcotics Task Force Confidential. Inside were photographs of evidence bags, notes in Harris's careful handwriting, and a single name circled twice, DS. She didn't know what it meant, but it scared her, because Harris never left things unfinished. Whatever DS stood for, it was something he had been chasing and maybe something that had finally caught up to him. By the 5th day, the town began to change. The diner where Harris used to get his morning coffee left a black ribbon on the counter. The church bells rang at noon for the safe return of one of our own. People locked their doors a little earlier. Neighbors stopped letting their kids walk home after dark. In a place like Asheville, where everyone knew everyone, trust was oxygen. And suddenly, it felt like the air was running out. On the 6th day, the search team expanded downstream. Divers swept a half-mile stretch of the French Broad River, moving methodically through murky brown water. Midway through the afternoon, one diver surfaced holding something small, metallic, dull from years of use. It was a police-issue flashlight, its casing dented, initials engraved at the base, HC. Laura fell to her knees when they handed it to her. "He was here," she whispered. "He was right here." But there were no more traces after that. No body, no footprints, no weapon, no sign of Harris Cole ever again. By week's end, the rescue mission turned into an investigation. The FBI joined the case. They reviewed the patrol logs. Harris had checked in at 10:42 p.m. from the south sector, then nothing. His last radio message was ordinary. 10:55 near the bridge. Checking it out. He never said what he found. At a press conference, Chief Davis faced a wall of microphones. Harris Cole was more than a detective, he said. He was a husband, a father, and a friend. We will not stop searching until we bring him home. His voice cracked on the last word. Behind the cameras, Laura watched silently, gripping Harris's badge in her hand. She didn't want to hear promises. She wanted answers. Weeks passed. The leaves turned from gold to brown, then fell away. The river froze at its edges. The posters faded. People stopped calling every day. But Laura didn't stop. Every night, she sat at the kitchen table, replaying his last voicemail. His voice calm, steady, familiar. "Don't wait up, honey. Got one last stop before I come home." Wait, that was the last time she ever heard him. When Christmas came, Laura wrapped his photo in white lights and placed it by the window. Sophie wrote letters she never mailed. Evan started visiting the gym every night, pushing himself until his muscles trembled, trying to become the kind of man his father had been. And still, nothing. No news. No closure. By the spring of 2003, the police department quietly scaled back the investigation. The files were boxed, labeled Cole Harris Missing, and placed in the Cold Case Archive, Row 3, Shelf 11. The badge was returned to Laura in a velvet pouch. She refused to accept it. "He's not gone," she told the chief. "You don't give back a badge until you know the man who wore it isn't coming home." For years after that, Asheville carried a ghost. Every new detective heard the story, the man who vanished by the river. People swore his spirit walked the bridge at night, radio whispering faint static through the fog. Some said he'd discovered something about another cop. Others said he'd been framed, but no one knew. The town moved on, at least on the surface. Underneath, the silence grew thick enough to choke on. 20 years later, that silence would finally break. But back then, it was just a wound, unseen, unhealed. On the 20th anniversary of Harris's disappearance, Laura drove down to the same stretch of river. The sky was gray, the air sharp with rain. She placed a single white rose in the water and whispered, "Come home." The current carried it downstream, vanishing around the bend. She turned to leave, then stopped. A glint caught her eye in the mud near the embankment. She bent down, brushing aside the wet leaves. It was a piece of metal, small, rusted, but unmistakable. She lifted it into the light, a spent shell casing. And engraved on the base, faint but visible, were 3 letters. What the fuck? Laura's breath caught in her throat. She looked toward the river, her heart pounding, and whispered the only name that came to her mind. David? The shell casing sat in a small evidence bag on Chief Davis's desk, its copper edge glinting under the fluorescent light. After 20 years of silence, It was the first new clue, and the room felt it. Davis turned the bag slowly in his hand, his jaw tight. Where exactly did she find this? Same spot by the French Broad, said the officer who brought it in. Near the embankment, washed out after last week's rain. The chief exhaled, a heavy, tired sound. He'd seen countless cases in his career, but this one, the Harris Cole case, had followed him like a ghost. 20 years, he murmured, and now the river decides to talk. By evening, news of the discovery spread. Reporters circled the department, hungry for a headline. The missing detective had become a myth in Asheville, a name carved on plaques, whispered in classrooms, told to recruits at the academy. He vanished, and no one ever found out why. Now, suddenly, there was a why begging to be uncovered. Chief Davis ordered the casing sent to Raleigh's crime lab. Technology had changed since 2000, and what had once been useless could now speak volumes. He also reopened the official file and reassigned one of his youngest detectives, Allison Pierce, to the case. Pierce was new to Asheville but had grown up not far away, in Greensboro. She'd been 8 years old when Harris Cole disappeared. She remembered the news stories, the search parties, the candlelight vigils, the photo of the smiling officer who never came home. When she got the assignment, she told Davis quietly, "Sir, I remember this case. My dad used to tell me about him, said he was one of the good ones." "That's exactly why I'm putting you on it," Davis replied. "Because good ones like him don't just disappear." The first thing Pierce did was visit Laura Cole. The house looked the same as in old photos, white siding, a porch swing that hadn't moved in years, wind chimes tangled from neglect. Laura answered the door slowly, as if she'd been expecting someone but not sure who. "I know you've had enough promises over the years," Pierce said softly, holding out her badge, "but I'm not here to make another one. I'm here to listen and to start over." Laura studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "You remind me of him. He always believed truth doesn't vanish, just hides." Inside, the living room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. On the mantel sat framed photographs: Harris in uniform, Evans Police Academy graduation, Sophie with her journalism award. Laura reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, worn notebook. He wrote everything down. Always did. But this one's different. I found it in his desk the week after he went missing. Pierce flipped through the pages. Most were notes, times, license plates, but near the end, the handwriting grew hurried, jagged. One line stood out. DS, Glock's number, WTF 194, meeting tomorrow, Midnight Bridge. Pierce froze. "DS," she whispered. "Who's that?" Laura looked away. "I never knew, but I remember a man named Slater, David Slater. He worked with Harris. They were close once." The next morning, Pierce dug through the archives at the precinct basement. Dust clung to everything. The Cole-Harris missing file was thick, overstuffed with old photos, witness statements, even newspaper clippings yellowed at the edges. She scanned the roster of officers assigned to the original task force. There it was, Lieutenant David Slater, task force co-lead. She leaned back in her chair, heart quickening. Slater had led the original investigation into Harris's disappearance. The irony hit her like a punch. Digging deeper, she found the incident report from 2001. Lieutenant Slater reported personal firearms stolen from his residence while on vacation. Weapon type: Glock 23. Serial number: 1TF194. Pierce stared at the page, the same code written in Harris's notebook. WTF194. The same letters engraved on the shell casing Laura had found by the river. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a map. That afternoon, she requested Slater's current address from personnel records. He'd retired in 2012, still living in Asheville near Beaver Lake, a quiet neighborhood of retirees, golf carts, and fishing boats. She drove there at sunset, the lake glowing orange in the fading light. Slater's house stood at the far end of the lane, 2 stories, perfectly kept. She parked across the street, pretending to check her phone as she watched him step out onto the porch. 70 years old, white hair, still broad-shouldered. He moved slowly but deliberately, like a man still trained to observe. He looked right at her car. For a moment, she thought he might walk over. Instead, he smiled a polite, empty smile and went back inside. Pierce's instincts burned. Something in that look wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. Back at the station, she pulled up Slater's personnel file. Commendations, leadership awards, a spotless record. The kind of man people called the backbone of the department. Yet in the old financial reports, there were deposits that didn't fit small at first, then growing. The last one dated October 12, 2002, 2 days before Harris vanished. Her pulse quickened. She printed the records, slipped them into a folder labeled Unconfirmed Corruption, and began to connect dots on the wall. Harris's note DS Glock 2F194, Slater unexplained money missing detective. The pattern was beginning to take shape, ugly and undeniable. But she needed proof. 2 days later, the Raleigh Crime Lab called back. The shell casing's ballistic grooves matched the markings of a Glock 23, consistent with law enforcement issue. But the lab technician added something else, something Pierce hadn't expected. "We found microscopic traces of river sediment inside the casing," the technician said. "Not outside, inside. That means it was fired near the river, then washed downstream recently. Whoever dumped it didn't do it 20 years ago. They did it now." Pierce went silent. That changed everything. Someone had tried to replant evidence, to redirect the investigation. But who would do that? Only someone who knew the case inside out. Only someone with a reason to keep it buried. That night, she returned to the riverbank with a flashlight and gloves, retracing Laura's steps. The moon hung low, silvering the water. Crickets hummed like static. She knelt near the embankment, sweeping the beam across the mud. Something glimmered, a small indentation in the soil. She brushed it carefully, revealing a shoe print. Fresh. Size 11. She measured it. The tread pattern was distinctive, police-issue tactical boots. Pierce felt her pulse in her throat. She followed the faint trail along the river's edge until it vanished near the rocks. That's when she noticed the sound, a distant splash, deliberate, not the wind. She turned off her flashlight and listened. Silence, then the crunch of gravel behind her. She spun around. Nothing. Just the dark stretch of the river and her own breath fogging in the cold air. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from the trees. By morning, she filed a brief report and sealed the shoe print photo in the evidence log. Chief Davis frowned as he read it. "You think someone's tampering with the site?" "I think someone's protecting it," she replied. His expression hardened. "You're saying an officer?" "I'm saying," Pierce said carefully, "whoever left that print was trained, and they knew where to step." Davis sighed, rubbing his temples. "Pierce, you're stirring up ghosts. Be careful. Slater's a respected man in this town. Don't accuse unless you're sure." She closed the file. "Then I guess it's time to be sure." That evening, Pierce sat in her car outside Slater's house again, notebook open on the steering wheel. The lights inside were on. Through the window she could see him at his dining table, reading something old papers spread across the wood. Her gaze caught on a photo frame beside him. Even from a distance, she recognized the face. Harris Cole, smiling in uniform. Slater reached out, turned the frame face down, and switched off the light. Pierce's breath caught. She jotted one sentence in her notebook. "He's still hiding something, and it's not regret." Then she looked back toward the quiet lake, moonlight rippling across the water, and whispered to herself, "The river gave up one secret. It's time it gave up the rest." By the time the sun rose over Asheville the next morning, the city looked the same, coffee shops opening, traffic lights blinking green, but something had shifted. For the first time in 20 years, the name Harris Cole was being spoken again, not as a legend or a ghost story, but as a case that might finally break open. Detective Allison Pierce barely slept. The image of Slater turning Harris's photo face down kept flashing in her mind. There was guilt in that gesture, or something darker. She needed more than instinct now. She needed proof. In the basement of the Asheville Police Department, Pierce went through the old case files one by one. Dust coated the folders like a film of neglect. She laid them across a long oak table. Photos, interview transcripts, evidence logs. The pages were brittle, edges curled from years of handling. The farther she read, the clearer it became the investigation had been steered away from something deliberately. Witness statements were incomplete. Patrol logs went missing for the week of October 14th, 2002. And most curious of all, 3 pieces of evidence listed in the initial report, a coffee cup, a notebook, and Harris's personal cell phone, had never been entered into the chain of custody database. Pierce whispered under her breath, "Someone buried more than a man here." Chief Davis stopped by around noon. His shoulders seemed heavier than usual. "You've been at this all night?" She nodded. "I've found gaps in the evidence records. Missing items, altered timesheets." Davis frowned. "Pierce, that case nearly broke this department once. Be sure you're ready to reopen old wounds." She met his gaze. "Sir, some wounds don't heal. They fester." He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, the kind of nod that meant, do what you have to do. That evening, Pierce visited Evan Cole, Harris's son. He was now a police sergeant in Charlotte, the same age his father had been when he vanished. His house was tidy, almost military. On the wall hung his father's framed service photo. "I grew up chasing his shadow," Evan said quietly. "Every time I put on the uniform, I hear people say I look like him. But no one talks about what happened. It's like a taboo in our family or a curse." And Pierce explained what she'd found: the casing, the matching serial number, the missing evidence. Evan's eyes hardened. "Slater," he muttered. "He used to come to our house. Brought us toys when we were kids. My mom trusted him. Hell, we all did." He walked over to the window, staring out at the street. "You think he killed my father?" Pierce hesitated. "I think your father found something he wasn't supposed to, and someone made sure he never talked about it." Evan turned back, his jaw set. "Then make them talk now." As days passed, Pierce pushed deeper. She pulled archived phone records from 2002, now digitized. Late on the night of October 13th, Harris had made one last outgoing call, a 4-minute conversation, to a prepaid phone that was never used again. Its location pinged near Beaver Lake, less than half a mile from Slater's home. That same hour, a cruiser had reported static interference on the police channel. The officer who logged it? Lieutenant David Slater. The puzzle pieces were no longer subtle. They screamed. Pierce gathered the timeline on a whiteboard, each event connected by red string. The room felt smaller as she stepped back, a web of betrayal stretching 20 years wide. She could almost feel Harris's presence in the silence, as if the air itself was waiting for her to finish what he started. That night, Pierce sat alone at her desk. Outside, the hum of the city faded into the sound of rain against the windows. She played back Harris's last radio transmission from the archive, the one recorded just before midnight on October 13th, 10:55 near the bridge, checking it out. Then a pause. "Copy that, dispatch. I think it's L." Static swallowed the rest. She replayed it 3 times, goosebumps running down her arms. The cutoff syllable wasn't random. It sounded like the start of a name. SL. She didn't need the rest. She already knew. 2 weeks later, the Raleigh lab returned with a supplemental report on the shell casing. They'd used a new process to lift trace DNA from inside the rim. The results were preliminary, but they were clear enough: partial match to a male subject in the law enforcement database. The name redacted on the report's cover page made Pierce's hands tremble. She peeled back the top sheet. Match. Slater. David R. She exhaled slowly, disbelief mingling with grim validation. The river hadn't just revealed Harris's story, it had named his killer. But before she could celebrate, a call came from Chief Davis. "Pierce, I just got word from evidence control. Someone accessed the Cole case files last night without authorization. Your name's on the log." "That's impossible," she said. "I wasn't even here." "I know," Davis replied, voice low, "which means someone used your credentials." She froze. "Who else has that clearance?" "Only me," Davis said quietly. "And Slater." Pierce's heart pounded as she drove toward the precinct. The hallways were dark, lit only by emergency lights. When she reached the records room, the door was ajar. Inside, The drawer labeled Cold Cases, 2002 stood open, empty space where the coal file should have been. She scanned the room. Flashlight beam sweeping across shelves, then stopped. On the floor lay one single page, left behind. It was the inventory log for the missing items Harris had collected the week before he disappeared. And scribbled in the corner, in handwriting too deliberate to be anyone else's, was a note that chilled her. "You're closer than you think." Her breath caught. Someone had been inside, watching her every move, just like at the riverbank. She backed toward the door, every instinct on alert. The motion sensor above the doorway blinked red, triggered. Someone else was still in the building. She turned, flashlight trembling in her hand, calling out, "Who's there?" No answer. Just the echo of her own voice, and the faint smell of rain drifting through the open window at the end of the hall. Pierce slowly approached, the beam of light cutting through the dark. The window swayed in the wind, raindrops dotting the floor. On the ledge sat a single object, freshly placed, gleaming even in the dim light. A police badge, old and worn, its metal edges tarnished by time. She picked it up. The engraving read, "Detective Harris Cole, 2147. Her pulse spiked. The badge had been missing for 20 years. Outside, thunder rumbled across the valley. Pierce looked out into the rain-soaked night and whispered, "You were right, Harris. The truth didn't vanish. It's coming for them." And somewhere in the darkness beyond the parking lot, a car engine started. The next morning, rain still clung to Asheville like a fever that wouldn't break. The river ran high and restless, its gray surface rippling with hidden currents. Detective Allison Pierce stood on the bridge where Harris Cole's patrol car had been found 20 years earlier, the missing badge cold in her hand. The badge was authentic, same serial number, same engraving, but its condition told another story. It hadn't been sitting in water for 2 decades. The edges were worn, but the metal was clean. Someone had kept it, protected it, and now they wanted it found. Chief Raymond Davis arrived a few minutes later, his coat soaked through. "You look like hell, Pierce." She gave a half smile. "I didn't sleep." "Neither did I," he said, glancing at the badge. "You think Slater's behind this?" "I don't think," she replied. "I know, but I can't prove it, not yet." Davis sighed, the sound weary and old. "We've got one shot at this. If we accuse a retired lieutenant without solid evidence, the whole department will implode." Pierce looked out over the river. "Then let's make sure we have solid evidence." That afternoon, she drove to Beaver Lake, Slater's neighborhood. The air was sharp, the sky the color of steel. She parked a block away, watching as Slater loaded fishing gear into his truck. He moved with calm precision, whistling softly. The image was almost wholesome, a man enjoying retirement, but to Pierce it was theater. Every smile, every gesture, rehearsed. As he drove off, she stepped out, slipped on gloves, and crossed to his property. The lakeside house was neat, too neat. The garage door was locked, but a narrow side door gave way after a gentle nudge from her shoulder. Inside, the air smelled of oil and varnish. Fishing rods lined the wall. But what caught her attention was the boat dock outside, freshly repaired posts, one darker than the rest, wood still new. She crouched down, tapping the post with her knuckles. It sounded hollow. Hair pulse quickened. Pulling a small screwdriver from her pocket, she wedged it under the base, prying gently until a thin line cracked open. Inside, something glinted metal, wrapped in plastic, sealed tight. Pierce's breath caught. It was a Glock 23, serial number faint but legible. WTF 194. Her heart pounded so loud she could barely hear the rain. The gun from Harris's notes, the same number from the shell casing, the same letters etched into evidence after 2 decades of silence. She snapped photos, bagged the weapon, and left the dock exactly as she found it. But before she could step off the property, the sound of tires crunching gravel froze her in place. Slater's truck. He was back. Pierce ducked behind the side of the house, holding her breath as the truck door slammed. Slater's footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. She peered through the slats of the deck. He paused, scanning the yard, eyes sharp despite his age. For a moment, his gaze stopped exactly where she stood. Then, slowly, he smiled, a knowing, eerie smile, and turned toward the lake. Pierce waited until he disappeared inside the house before sprinting back to her car, adrenaline flooding her veins. She didn't stop shaking until she reached the precinct. In Chief Davis's office, she laid the evidence bag on his desk. "We have it." The gun. His gun. Davis stared at it, jaw tightening. "You're telling me this was hidden on Slater's property?" "Yes, sir. In the dock, wrapped and sealed. It's the same serial number that Harris wrote in his notebook." He sat down heavily, rubbing his temples. "Pierce, do you have any idea what this means?" "I do," she said quietly. "It means one of our own murdered Harris Cole and then helped lead the investigation." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Davis exhaled. "We'll send it to Quantico for ballistic comparison. But if this matches the bullet that killed him..." "It will," Pierce said. "I can feel it." That night, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The rain had stopped, but her apartment windows fogged with humidity, turning the city lights into a blur. She sat at her desk, reading through the recovered files, Harris's old notes, Slater's reports, the deposit slips that hinted at dirty money. The phone rang once, twice. When she answered, no one spoke, just breathing. "Who is this?" she asked. Silence. Then, a familiar voice, low and calm. "Detective Pierce. You should have left the river alone." The line went dead. Pierce's blood ran cold. She checked the caller ID, no number. Her instincts screamed. She grabbed her gun and looked through the blinds, scanning the street. A black sedan idled near the curb, headlights off. When she lifted her phone to take a picture, the car pulled away, tires whispering on wet pavement. At dawn, Davis called. "Pierce, you'd better sit down." "What happened?" "Quantico just confirmed the ballistic match. It's the same weapon. The gun from Slater's dock fired the bullet that killed Harris Cole." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. 2 decades of questions collapsed into one truth. Harris hadn't disappeared. He'd been silenced. "Get a warrant," she said. "We're bringing him in." But when officers arrived at Slater's home 2 hours later, the truck was gone. The house was empty. The back door hung open, a faint trail of footprints leading down to the lake. They followed the trail to the dock. The boards creaked underfoot. The water below shimmered, dark and cold. At the end of the dock sat a folded fishing hat and a sealed envelope weighed down by a stone. Pierce opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper written in neat, practiced handwriting. He was right. The system is rotten. But you won't find me in it. And below the words a drawing of a badge. Number 2147. Harris Cole. Pierce stared at the note, wind whipping her hair across her face. The lake was still, except for the faint ripple of a current beneath the dock. A current that seemed to pull downward, toward the dark. Davis stepped beside her. "You think he ran?" Pierce shook her head slowly. "No, he's too proud to run." "Then where the hell is he?" Davis asked. She looked out across the gray water, the reflection of clouds shifting like ghosts, and whispered, "Where all his secrets are under the surface." As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed an anonymous message with no number, just 6 words. "You're next. Stay out of it." Pierce stared at the screen, jaw tightening, rain starting to fall again in cold, steady drops. "Too late," she murmured. "I'm already in." The text message lingered on Detective Allison Pierce's phone like a bruise. "You're next. Stay out of it." She stared at the words long after the screen dimmed, the blue glow fading into the dark. Whoever sent it wasn't bluffing. They knew where she lived. They knew what she was chasing. By morning, she'd made a decision. She wasn't backing down. Pierce drove to headquarters early, coffee in hand, rain tapping against the windshield. Inside, Chief Raymond Davis was already waiting, arms folded, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. "I heard about the message," he said. "You need a security detail." She shook her head. "No. If they see I'm rattled, they win." Davis sighed. "You sound like Harris." He said the same damn thing. That made her pause. What do you mean? He hesitated. 2 days before he disappeared, Harris came to me, said he was close to uncovering something big, something inside the department. He didn't give names, just told me, if I go missing, don't trust anyone who calls themselves a friend. Pierce felt a chill crawl up her spine. You think Slater knew? I think Slater was the something big, Davis said quietly. Later that day, Pierce met with Special Agent Marcus Whitman from the FBI's Quantico lab, the same man who'd confirmed the ballistic match. They met in a small diner off I-26, far from city ears. The kind of place where the coffee's bad but the silence is safe. You were right, Whitman said, sliding a folder across the table. The Glock 23 from Slater's dock fired the bullet that killed Harris Cole. No doubt. Pierce nodded grimly. That gives us the how. Now we need the why. Whitman leaned closer. You're not going to like this part. He opened another file. Inside were scanned bank statements, offshore accounts, multiple shell corporations, all tied to deposits from 1996 through 2002. Follow the money, he said. It all leads to one name, Cabrera Logistics. Pierce frowned. Sounds like a transport company. It was, on paper. In reality, it was a front for a mid-level drug syndicate running product through the Appalachian corridor. The kicker? Several local law enforcement officers were on their payroll, including, it seems, Lieutenant David Slater. Pierce exhaled sharply. Harris must have found the link. Exactly, Whitman said. He was probably building a case off the books, quiet. When Slater realized he was being investigated, he acted first. She sat back, heart pounding. Everything suddenly made sense, the midnight meeting, the erased data, the false reports. Slater hadn't just silenced Harris. He'd infiltrated his own investigation. That evening, Pierce returned to her apartment to find the front door slightly ajar. Her hand went to her weapon instantly. Police. Announce yourself. No answer. She swept the entryway, living room clear, kitchen clear, until she reached the small study where she kept her files. The air inside felt colder, touched by rain and something else. Intrusion. Papers littered the floor. Her computer was on, screen blinking with a single open document. It wasn't hers. 3 words appeared on the screen. You missed something. Her stomach dropped. She turned toward the bulletin board on the wall, the red string web of Harris's notes and Slater's connections. Someone had added a new photo to it. Harris en photo. It showed Pierce herself standing at the riverbank 2 nights ago, flashlight in hand. She froze. Someone was watching her every move. The next day, she met again with Evan Cole, Harris's son, at the local memorial park. Rain slicked the bronze statue of his father, Detective Harris Cole, notebook in hand. Eternal. Whoever's doing this, they're not just protecting Slater, Pierce said. They're protecting the entire network he worked for. Evan clenched his jaw. You think my father knew all of them? He knew enough to scare them, she said. He nodded slowly, eyes burning with quiet fury. Then let's scare them back. Working together, Pierce and Evan dug into archived financial records, property deeds, and interdepartmental memos. One name kept resurfacing alongside Slater's in signatures and authorizations. Captain Roy Henson, now retired, living outside of Asheville. Henson had been Slater's direct superior at the time of Harris's disappearance. He'd signed off on the investigation, approved evidence transfers, and personally handled the retrieval of Harris's vehicle from the riverbank. Pierce clenched her fist. If anyone helped cover this up, it was him. They drove out to Henson's property that evening, a small cabin tucked deep in the Blue Ridge foothills. The drive up was quiet, fog curling between the trees. When they arrived, the porch light was on, but the door slightly open. The same eerie detail Pierce had learned to dread. Inside, the cabin was empty, but on the kitchen table sat a folder marked Cold Case 2002. Pierce opened it slowly. Inside were copies of internal memos from 20 years ago, stamped Confidential. One letter, dated October 16th, 2002, 2 days after Harris vanished, was signed by both Slater and Henson. It read, Evidence pertaining to Officer Cole's disappearance has been reclassified for departmental integrity. Transfer to Internal Affairs complete. But there was no record of that transfer ever happening. Pierce turned the page and froze. The next document was a report she'd never seen before. Subject Cole believed to have discovered financial irregularities implicating multiple senior officers. Recommend termination of inquiry and reassignment of related personnel. In the margin, a handwritten note in blue ink. Handled, D.S. Slater's initials. Her throat went dry. Before she could process it, a creak came from the hallway. Evan spun toward the sound. Gun raised. Police, show yourself. A figure stepped out of the shadows, thin, trembling, pale as paper. It was Captain Roy Henson himself. I knew this day would come, he rasped. You shouldn't be here. Pierce lowered her gun slightly. Where's Slater? Henson's eyes darted toward the window. He's gone, but not far. What do you mean? He told me if anyone ever reopened this case, he'd come back to finish what he started. Where is he now, Captain? She pressed. Henson swallowed hard. He said he'd be waiting where it all began. Pierce exchanged a look with Evan. They both knew where that was. The river. As they stepped outside, headlights flashed through the fog, a car speeding down the dirt road toward them. Get down, Pierce shouted. Gunfire split the air, shattering the cabin window. Henson fell instantly, a red bloom spreading across his chest. Pierce ducked behind the porch column, returning fire toward the woods. The engine roared, and the car disappeared into the trees. When the gunfire stopped, only the sound of rain remained. Evan knelt beside Henson, but it was too late. The old man's lips moved once, barely a whisper. The dock, the second post. Then his eyes went still. Pierce's heart hammered. He's sending us back. Evan stood, jaw clenched, rain running down his face. Then that's where we go. Pierce looked toward the darkness beyond the trees, toward Beaver Lake, and felt the cold, familiar pull of the truth drawing her in again. The storm came hard that night, the kind of southern rain that sounded like static against the windows and smelled faintly of metal. Detective Allison Pierce stood by the lake's edge with Evan Cole, flashlights cutting through the mist. The water lapped softly against the dock, hiding everything it wanted to keep. The second post, Evan whispered, staring at the shadowed structure. That's what Henson said before he died. Pierce nodded, her breath visible in the cold air. The dock stretched ahead like an old scarboard swollen from years of weather, bolts rusted to the color of blood. It looked peaceful, but the peace was a lie. Somewhere under that wood, under that black water, lay the reason Harris Cole never came home. They walked slowly down the dock, boards creaking beneath their boots. Every sound felt amplified, the hum of insects, the splash of fish below, the faint rumble of thunder far off. When they reached the middle, Pierce knelt beside the second post. Her flashlight beam followed a faint line, a seam in the wood. She pressed a gloved hand to it. This one's newer than the others, she said. Look at the grain. Evan crouched beside her. You think he hid something else here? She pulled a screwdriver from her pocket, wedged it into the seam, and twisted. The board lifted slightly, then caught. She pried harder, the wet wood groaning. Beneath it, plastic shimmered under the beam of her light, another waterproof container, smaller than the one that had held the gun. Pierce lifted it out carefully and unsealed the top. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, some grainy, others sharp. She spread them across the dock. The images showed police officers, some in uniform, some not, shaking hands with men she didn't recognize. But the last photo stopped her cold. It showed Harris Cole standing beside Lieutenant David Slater, both smiling, with a third man in the background, Captain Roy Henson. In Harris's hand was a manila folder labeled Cabrera Logistics. Evan swallowed hard. That's the same file you found in Henson's cabin. Pierce nodded slowly. This wasn't a clue, she murmured. This was evidence. Harris hid it here before he was killed. She turned over one of the photos. There was writing on the back, faded but still legible. Meeting arranged. DS doesn't know I have proof. October 13th. Evan's voice cracked. That's the night he disappeared. Pierce looked up toward the dark water, realization cutting through her. He didn't just meet Slater at the river. He brought the evidence with him. A faint noise broke the silence, a soft crunching of gravel near the shore. Both turned their flashlights toward the sound, beams crossing through the mist. "Who's there?" Pierce called. No answer, only the wind moving through the trees. She scanned the shoreline again, then froze. A figure stood just beyond the light's reach, tall, still, watching. Evan raised his gun. "Show yourself." The figure didn't move. Then, with a slow, deliberate step, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Pierce's pulse surged. "Let's move." They sprinted down the dock, but by the time they reached the shore, the figure was gone. Only tire tracks in the mud and the faint smell of gasoline lingering in the damp air. Evan cursed under his breath. "He's toying with us." Pierce crouched to photograph the tire impressions. "No," she said quietly. "He's warning us." Back at the precinct, soaked and trembling, they laid out the recovered photos under bright fluorescent light. Chief Raymond Davis joined them, face pale as he looked over the evidence. "This connects everything," he said. "The cartel, the bribes, the department cover-up, all of it." Pierce nodded. "And Harris figured it out 20 years ago. Slater killed him before he could hand it over." Davis's voice dropped. "Pierce, you realize what this means. There are still people in this city who benefited from that cover-up. Some of them might still be wearing the badge." Her stomach tightened. "Then we expose them. All of them." But before she could speak again, an officer burst through the door, breathless. "Chief, we've got a situation." "What kind of situation?" Davis demanded. "Fire," the officer said. "At the old storage facility on Riverbend Road, the one the task force used back in 2002. Evan's face went pale. "That's where my dad used to store his off-record case files." They arrived within minutes. Flames clawed at the night sky, painting the clouds orange. Fire trucks lined the street, their sirens howling. The air reeked of smoke and gasoline. Pierce shouted over the chaos. "Where did it start?" One firefighter pointed toward the back. "Old file room. Everything's gone." Evan stared at the blaze, fists clenched. "He's burning what's left." Pierce grabbed his arm. "Not everything. We still have the photos. The gun. The shell casing. We have enough." But deep down, she wasn't sure. The fire wasn't just about destroying evidence. It was about control. Whoever orchestrated this wanted her to feel helpless. As the flames died and the night fell silent again, she noticed something glinting near the parking lot. A piece of metal, half buried in ash. She crouched and brushed off the soot. It was a police nameplate, warped from heat. "Loot, D. Slater." Evan looked over her shoulder. "You think he was here?" She nodded slowly. "Or he wanted us to think he was." Hours later, back at her apartment, exhaustion finally hit. The city outside was quiet, too quiet. She hung her wet coat by the door and poured herself a glass of water, her hands trembling. Then she saw a shadow flickering across her living room wall. She turned sharply, gun raised. But the room was empty. Her heart thudded as she moved closer. On her kitchen counter sat an envelope, dry despite the rain. She hadn't left it there. With gloved hands, she opened it. Inside was a photograph, the same one she'd found at the dock. Only this time, a new line had been written across it in red ink. "The river remembers what you forget." Beneath the photo was a small metal tag, corroded, stamped with a number. Harris Cole's badge number. Pierce's breath caught in her throat. Whoever had broken in wasn't just sending a message. They'd been inside long enough to know exactly what would haunt her most. She set the photo down slowly, her pulse hammering, her apartment suddenly feeling smaller, tighter. Then her phone buzzed again. One new message. It wasn't a threat this time. It was an address. Maple Creek Road, the place where Harris Cole vanished. And below it, 6 chilling words. "Come alone, or he dies again." Pierce stared at the message, the reflection of the screen glowing in her eyes. For the first time since this began, she felt something colder than fear, certainty. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about finishing what Harris started. She holstered her weapon, grabbed her coat, and whispered into the silence, "All right, Slater, Let's finish this by the river. The road to Maple Creek wound through the trees like a secret the forest didn't want to share. Detective Allison Pierce drove with her headlights dimmed, rain tapping steady against the windshield, her pulse keeping rhythm with every turn. The message still glowed on her phone screen beside her. Come alone, or he dies again. She didn't know who he was supposed to be, maybe Evan Cole, maybe the ghost of his father, but she knew one thing for certain. This night wasn't about warnings anymore. It was about endings. When she reached the end of the dirt road, the river came into view, wide, dark, restless. The same place where Harris Cole had disappeared 2 decades earlier. Pierce parked, stepped out into the cold air, and immediately smelled it: mud, rain, and something metallic, faint but distinct: blood. Her flashlight cut through the mist, sweeping over the overgrown grass, until it caught on something: an old police barricade, half buried, the paint nearly gone. Time had eaten everything here, except memory. She whispered into the night. All right, Slater, I'm here. Nothing. Only the slow whisper of water. She took a few steps closer to the riverbank, her boots sinking into soft earth. Then, suddenly, a voice. Detective Pierce. She spun around, gun raised. From the shadows near the tree line stepped Lieutenant David Slater. Older, yes, thinner, slower, but the calm arrogance in his face was unchanged. He wasn't hiding anymore. He looked like a man who'd made peace with his sins. I thought you'd bring backup, he said. But you didn't. That's good. Harris would have liked you. Don't, Pierce snapped. You don't get to say his name. Slater smiled faintly. I think I've earned the right. After all, I buried him. The words landed like a punch. She steadied her gun. You're going to tell me where? I will, he said, stepping closer, hands slightly raised. But first, you need to understand something. Harris wasn't just killed because he found corruption. He was killed because he believed he could fix it. Pierce's grip tightened. He tried to expose you. He tried to expose all of us, Slater said quietly. You think I was alone? I was the fall guy. The cartel paid plenty of others, officers, judges, prosecutors. Harris was about to take down an entire system. The night we met here, he gave me a choice. Turn myself in, or he'd go public. You don't threaten men who built their lives on lies. He took another step. I told him we'd talk. I told him to trust me. Just one more time. Pierce's voice was barely a whisper. And you shot him. Slater's eyes flickered, not with regret, but memory. Right there, by the water. One clean shot. He didn't even raise his gun. He looked at me like he already knew. The sound of the river filled the silence between them. Pierce could hear her heart pounding in her ears. You've been hiding behind that badge for 20 years, she said, attending vigils, consoling his family. What kind of man does that? The kind who wanted to believe it was worth something, Slater said. If I couldn't fix what I'd done, I could at least protect what he left behind. Pierce frowned. You mean his family? He nodded. The night I killed him, he told me something before he died. He said, don't let them touch my kids. Her stomach turned. You expect me to believe you did this for them? Slater's voice broke slightly. I kept the cartel away from the Coles. I fed them misinformation for years. Made them think Harris died clean, no files, no leaks. It worked. Until you came along. Pierce stared at him. The river wind slicing through the moment. So what now, you kill me too? He shook his head slowly. No, I'm done killing. But there's something you should see. He gestured toward the water's edge, 20 feet out. Under the rock shelf. That's where he is. Pierce's breath caught. His body? Slater nodded. I weighted him down, buried the past where no one would look. She took a step forward, but his voice stopped her. If you go in there tonight, you won't come back out. I'm not asking your permission, she said. Slater smiled faintly. No, you wouldn't. Before she could respond, headlights flashed behind them. A car barreled down the dirt road, tires spinning mud. Pierce turned, gun raised, as Evan Cole jumped out. Pierce, he shouted. You shouldn't be here alone. Slater's eyes widened. You brought him. I didn't, she said, startled. He must have tracked my phone. Evan's gaze locked on Slater, His voice trembled with rage. "You killed my father." Slater didn't deny it. "I did. M." The air split with the sound of thunder and then gunfire. Evan fired first. Slater dove behind a tree, returning fire with terrifying precision for a man his age. Bullets cracked through branches. Pierce shouted, "Evan, stop. Don't." Too late. A shot rang out. Evan fell to his knees, clutching his shoulder. Pierce returned fire, hitting Slater's arm. He stumbled backward, the gun falling into the mud. For a long second, there was only breathing heavy, ragged, wet with rain and pain. Pierce approached cautiously, weapon drawn. "It's over, Slater." He looked up at her, blood running down his sleeve, rain washing it away. "Over?" he repeated, laughing weakly. "You still think there's such a thing as over?" He nodded toward the river. "The others, they never stopped. You think I'm the end of it?" "I was just the start." Pierce frowned. "What others?" He coughed, the sound broken. "There's a hard drive. In my house. Behind the wall in my study. Everything's on it, names, dates, accounts. The people Harris tried to expose. You bring that out, you'll burn the whole system down." Pierce stepped closer, rain dripping off her cap. "Where exactly?" He smiled faintly. "You'll find it. Just remember." His voice faltered, fading into the sound of rain. "The river keeps secrets longer than people do." His head fell back. He was gone. Pierce knelt beside him, checking for a pulse, but there was none. For the first time that night, silence felt heavy, final. Evan groaned behind her, clutching his shoulder. "Is he dead?" "Yes," she said quietly. "But he didn't die clean." She looked back toward the river, the current swirling where Slater had pointed. A faint reflection glimmered beneath the surface, something metallic, catching the moonlight. The badge, Harris Cole's badge. It had surfaced again, just like before, turning slowly in the water as if the river was giving back another truth. Pierce whispered, "It remembers him." Evan's voice trembled. "What now?" She looked down at Slater's lifeless body, then toward the water where Harris had been lost, and said, "Now we finish what they both started." The wind rose, carrying the smell of rain and earth and something sacred, redemption maybe, or justice on its way. In the distance, sirens began to wail, echoing across the valley. Pierce holstered her weapon, pressed her hand to the badge at her chest, and said softly, "We're not done yet, Harris. Not until they all fall." And behind her, unnoticed in the storm, a red light blinked once inside the woods, the lens of a hidden camera. Someone had been watching the whole thing. The sirens arrived minutes too late. By the time the first patrol cars pulled up along the riverbank, Lieutenant David Slater was already dead, the gunfire long silent, and the storm fading into a soft, haunted drizzle. Detective Allison Pierce stood beneath the flickering blue lights, soaked, exhausted, and hollow. Her clothes clung to her skin, but she didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the dark current where Harris Cole had vanished 20 years ago. She could still see it, the faint glint of his badge beneath the surface, before it disappeared again, swallowed by the river one last time. Chief Raymond Davis arrived, stepping carefully through the mud. "You all right?" Pierce nodded weakly. "Evans hit in the shoulder. EMS is patching him up." Davis glanced toward the paramedics working nearby, then to Slater's body. "So it's true. It's over," Pierce said quietly. But Davis shook his head. "No, Pierce, it's not over. It's only started." He handed her a towel from his car. "You said Slater mentioned a hard drive?" Pierce nodded. "Behind the wall in his study. He said it holds everything, the names, the money, the deals Harris uncovered before he died. Then we find it," Davis said, "before someone else does." By sunrise, they were at Slater's house on Beaver Lake. The property was quiet, eerily so. The morning fog hung low across the water, making it look like the whole place was floating in a dream. Inside, everything was neat, too neat. The kitchen spotless, the couch cushions perfectly aligned, the air faintly scented with tobacco and old varnish. Slater had lived like a man who wanted control over everything except the chaos inside his own soul. Pierce and Davis moved through the rooms methodically. In the study, she found a section of wall behind the bookshelf that sounded hollow. With Davis's help, she pried it open. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a small metal case. Dusty, heavy, and locked. Pierce stared at it for a long moment before whispering, "This is what he died for." Davis nodded. "Let's see what's inside." They brought the case back to the precinct, where the tech unit carefully cracked it open. Inside were 3 items: a flash drive, a thick stack of documents, and a small envelope labeled, "For Maria." Pierce felt her throat tighten. Maria Cole, Harris's widow. While the tech team loaded the drive, Pierce stepped outside, holding the envelope carefully. The morning air smelled of pine and rain-soaked earth. She opened the flap gently and pulled out a single handwritten letter. "Maria, if you're reading this, I didn't make it home, but I need you to know the truth. There are people wearing badges who don't deserve them. I thought I could fight them quietly. I was wrong. I left what I found with someone I trust. If he fails me, the river will not. Truth always floats back. Tell the kids I love them. Tell them to keep their hands clean. And tell them justice is not a job, it's a promise. Harris." Pierce's eyes blurred. The paper trembled in her hands as she whispered. He knew he was walking into his own death. Davis stepped beside her, his voice soft. "Some people fight knowing they'll lose because it's the only fight that matters." An hour later, the flash drive's contents began to load on the screen. The files were meticulous bank statements, signed authorizations, offshore accounts, and the names. Pierce's stomach turned as she read them. Judges, detectives, city officials, people who'd built careers pretending to serve justice while selling it piece by piece. Harris Cole hadn't stumbled into corruption. He'd uncovered an entire network. "Good God," Davis muttered. "This could tear the state apart." Pierce nodded. "Then let it." She copied the files, encrypted them, and prepared to hand everything to federal authorities. The chain of deceit that began in 2002 was finally broken. But even as relief washed through her, a shadow of unease lingered. Slater had said others were still out there, men who'd kept their hands clean by letting others do the dirty work. The river might have given up one secret, but how many more still slept beneath the surface? That afternoon, Pierce visited Maria Cole. The older woman opened the door slowly, her eyes tired but gentle. She'd lived with grief long enough to recognize the look on another's face. "Is it true?" Maria asked softly. "They found him?" Pierce hesitated. "We found what he wanted us to, the truth." She handed her the envelope. Maria opened it, and as she read, her hand went to her mouth. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. "He always said the river remembers," Maria whispered. "I thought he meant the current. I didn't realize he meant people like you." Pierce smiled faintly. "He left breadcrumbs. I just followed them." Maria placed a trembling hand on Pierce's arm. "You brought him home, detective. Not his body, but what mattered." That evening, Pierce drove one last time to the river. The sun was setting low, streaking the sky in gold and crimson, the same colors that had stained that night 20 years ago. She stood by the water, the sound of it steady, alive. Beside her lay a single police badge number 2147, cleaned and polished, glinting in the fading light. She whispered, "You can rest now, Harris. Your story's told." A light breeze stirred the trees. The badge caught the last beam of sunlight and slipped from her fingers into the current, vanishing beneath the water where truth had always waited. Back at the precinct, Davis entered the room quietly. "FBI's on their way. They'll take over from here." Pierce nodded, closing the last file. "Then it's done." He studied her face. "You ever wonder if truth costs too much?" She smiled faintly, exhausted but certain. "Truth doesn't cost. It collects." Davis chuckled softly. "You sound like Harris." Pierce looked out the window at the darkening river below. "Maybe I do." Her phone buzzed once. A message. Unknown number. She frowned, opened it. "You did good, detective. But some of us aren't done yet. No name, no signature. Just those words." She stared at the screen, heartbeat steady. Somewhere, out there, The current was still moving, carrying stories yet untold. Pierce slipped her badge into her coat pocket, turned off the office light, and walked out into the rain. As the door closed behind her, thunder rolled across the hills, not threatening, but cleansing. Justice, like the river, had finally begun to flow again. The story of the vanishing of Detective Harris Cole carries a profound message about truth, integrity, and the quiet war between morality and power that still exists in everyday life. Beneath the surface of its crime and mystery lies something far more human. The reminder that justice is not just a courtroom verdict, but a commitment to doing what's right even when no one is watching. Harris Cole's disappearance, and the decades-long pursuit of truth that followed, mirror the struggles many people face when confronting corruption, silence, or personal betrayal. His courage to stand alone against a system designed to bury him reflects the kind of moral strength that defines real heroes, the ones who choose truth over comfort and sacrifice over convenience. The story also reminds us of the cost of forgetting. The town of Asheville, haunted for 20 years by unanswered questions, represents any community that chooses peace over truth and pays for it in quiet guilt. Detective Allison Pierce embodies hope reborn, the belief that even after years of decay, courage can still breathe life into justice. Through her persistence, the past finds its voice again, proving that time may bury evidence, but it cannot bury conscience. In a world where trust in institutions often feels fragile, this story gives something back, a sense that integrity still matters. It reminds us that every lie, no matter how carefully hidden, eventually rises to the surface, just like Harris Cole's badge glimmering beneath the water. The river in the story becomes a living metaphor. Time, memory, and truth always moving forward. No matter how dark the current, it carries the same promise the river remembers, and so must we.